Good. So you can start, George. As soon as I get your. Just have to get your slides up here somehow.
Oh, I see.
There we go. So I've got the outline up now.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, thank you for inviting me in. I used to always say that if there was 3 people in a room that shared an interest in the topic, your seminar was a success.
Yes.
And also, I always like getting asked to do these things because it's a chance to think about the issues again, and it's really quite fun for me to try to think about the issues again. Ian asked me first to say, oh, you did a piece at McLaughlin on income inequality. He said a couple of years ago. I looked it up, Ian, it was 2013.
Yes. Time flies.
And he said, could you update it? And I thought, well, that's sure, because I had actually started to think about doing some work in this area anyway. And then he added something later, which was, why is it in the last election that the issue of income inequality didn't appear at all? Both Mr. Carney and Mr. Polyev didn't really raise the issue, even though by any normal measurement standards, the problem remains quite as severe as it has been. So those are the 2 things I started to look at, and I thought, well, perhaps as we take an historical view, this will help us to understand this final question. So what I did was I tried to take an historical view and then return finally to the question of what explains where we are now in some sense. So in terms of what I want to cover, I'll begin with sort of a bit of a preamble, sort of just as we think about income inequality, what sort of things arise, but also just talk about how we measure income inequality. And there's one measure, the Gini coefficient, I won't use it, but another one, a decile distribution, which sort of summarizes the whole picture. But it turns out that these single summaries don't give us a lot of detail about what's going on at the very low end and the very top end. And so we need to look often particularly at the low end, at the top end, and increasingly in the last 20 years, there's been issues about the middle. So that's part of what I want to do in that overview. So there you'll see in the outline that when I went historically, and I draw a lot on work by Lars Horsberg from Dalhousie, who's written now 3 books on income inequality in Canada, and they're certainly the best data sources, and he's very, very careful about what he writes, so they're good to read. So I basically, as I worked on this, the number of periods changed back and forth because it's rather hard to find what you really think isolates a key period. But I chose period 1, 1950 to 1975, and by the summary of the decile distribution, this was an extremely stable period for income inequality. But as we'll see, there's lots of aspects of each period which we need to really understand the picture. The second period was from 1975, and I chose that date. That's just kind of after the Arab oil embargo brought that recession, and then took it to 95, which is when it was after the Chrétien-Martin transfer cuts and the economy had started to grow again. So there's this period between 75 and 95 where there was increasing inequality. Then period 3, a lot of people talk about, oh, everything's getting more unequal, more unequal, more unequal. In fact, we sort of stabilized in the summary from 95 to 2020, although as we'll see, that kind of divides into 2 periods. And then I argue we've got a period 4 in which there is, it's an extraordinary turbulent period. So I took COVID as the starting date, and the income inequality stuff went all over the place in COVID. And since that time, and particularly since 2025, the huge turbulence has entered into so we really can't say anything particularly about the trajectory of this next period. Then I argue that populism, and particularly right-wing populism, is emerging as a way to frame our understanding of what inequality means. It's a very different frame than the one we're used to, but I think now it's there, and how it will work itself out, we'll see. And then I have some concluding reflections. And also throughout, I argue that in one period there was a consensus, then there was a critique, and then out of that came a sort of synthesis of the critique in the previous period. And now we're entering into another period of critique, right-wing liberalism, of the sort of, I'm going to call it the third way consensus that was there from 95 to 2020. All right, so now let's just have a few words on thinking about income inequality. You should always, Osberg always begins, and I think it's a good way always to begin. It says, Canada is a high income country with considerable inequality. So there's a big pie and there's a lot of inequality. It doesn't matter where you look. In time, we were, relative to the world, high income country, and there was considerable inequality. And so within this, the sort of clear statement is market economies, or capitalism, whatever you want to call it, generates income inequality. Second, you want to think about the market incomes inequality, and then the after-tax, after-transfer inequalities. And public policy has a considerable effect and reduces inequality between market outcomes and after-tax, after-transfers. But surprisingly, the broad trends go the same way. So then, just to touch base to the nature of the collegium, I don't want to go too far on this, but relative to the elites, of which I name us all a member of, understanding populism, assessing inequality is a value judgment that requires public ethics, or requires a norm or a value to say this is an acceptable distribution of income, or this policy which takes from these and gives to those is a net benefit to society. You have to have a value system, and I think our training in philosophy tells us that people hold different values, and they can be not reconcilable. And the only thing we've worked out in our liberal democracies to sort out values is through the political process. And that's where we come to. Second thing I want to mention here is that when we talk about inequality, it's usually relative incomes that we're talking about. This person relative to that, they're unequal. Whereas particularly as I went through this historical look, it becomes very clear to me that absolute standard of living is very important to people. And they look at the world quite differently when their absolute standard of living is moving up. Doesn't matter how they compare to anybody else, when it's moving up, than when they are stable or falling or feeling insecure in that income, even though their income is there. So it's a more absolute. So now let's say a few words that I talked about in terms of measuring inequality. So we have this decile distribution, and everyone here is familiar with what that means. And so roughly speaking, the top 10% have 20% of the total income, and the bottom 10% have about 2, 3, 4% of the income. It's often we have a top 10 to bottom 10 ratio of 10 to 1. That's a kind of big summary measure. So if you look at all those percentages and watch them through time, if they're stable, we say overall income inequality stable. When you look at the bottom, you could just look at the share, but a great deal of the work on income inequality focuses on this concept of poverty, which can usually be, at least in the context I'm going to use it, an absolute measure. The value system is that everyone is entitled to have an adequate standard of living or live with dignity in their society, and it focuses on consumption of all the basics. And Canada now has an official poverty line. We didn't until about 6 or 7 years ago, and it's a market basket measure. So and of course, the market basket measure changes over time. If you're in fact, if you were in the 50s in Canada, part of the market basket would be, do you have indoor plumbing? And now everybody has indoor plumbing, or it's only a choice that they don't. And so that's not in the market basket anymore. About 8 years ago, Canada's market basket added a cell phone. The belief was that to fully participate in society, you had to be able to have a cell phone. And what I find intriguing is that in many parts of Africa, more people have cell phones than they have access to plumbing. So then we go to high incomes. What's going on at the high income level? And it's as we go through the historical sequence, has attracted a great deal of attention. And we talked about the top 1%, but as time went on and people got better and better data or looked at it, was not just the top 1%, it was the top 0.1% and even the 0.01%. And that the income growth we were witnessing was heavily concentrated at the top end, and even within that, at the top end. And then people begin to think about the middle. And I use the word middle class standard of living. I didn't use lower class. I didn't use upper class. I could just define those by income. But I believe there's something about the middle when we start to talk about it, which is not just an income measure. It has to do with a way of living. I'm calling it a standard of living. And I think as we go on, and I'm going to argue that middle class insecurity has been a big part of what's become the politics of income inequality, in contrast to what it was in the 75 to 95 period. And so as we go on each period, I'm going to say that to understand each period, you need to know not only the picture of inequality, but also the economic context of that period. How are overall incomes growing? Were there recessions? What's the unemployment rate? What's causing that unemployment? And one of the things I'm going to argue is that over this historical time period, we've been switching from unemployment, which economists call cyclical unemployment, which is just part of the normal functioning of the instability of a capitalist economy, versus what's called structural unemployment, where the structure of the economy changes. Manufacturing moves out of your country. The structure changes, and it's a very different phenomenon, requires different public policies to address structural unemployment compared to cyclical unemployment. And then, of course, the political context. And as I've argued, as we look through history here, we'll see there was a consensus, a critique, perhaps a synthesis, perhaps it becomes polarization. And now we're going through another critique, and who knows whether there'll be a synthesis. So just let me move very quickly through to conclude this quick look at inequality. There are many, many related concepts to income inequality. Some closely, some not so closely, but all. So the first half of that list, inequality of opportunity. A lot of people focus on inequality of opportunity rather than income inequality. Then there's the longer term question of inequality of wealth, and prolonged income inequality generates inequality of wealth. And certainly when you've seen countries like the United States in the last 15 years where the income inequality has soared, the wealth inequality has become even greater. You can think about inequality as discrimination. I am not treated equally to other people in this country because I am discriminated against. Then, and this is always there in the background, but once you start thinking about it this way, it changes the kind of dynamic of it. An inequality of outcome, and you're asking the question, let's take poverty, who is poor? Okay, so instead of saying, let's just look at the poverty rate, we start to say, well, who is poor? As we'll see, originally, we focused, or the data told us the big inequalities were urban, rural, and Atlantic versus the rest of the country. But over time, it moved to questions of first sex, the place of women, and then broadened to include gender, ethnicity, immigration status, religion, race. And so once you start to talk about inequality that way, it begins to bring very much into the debate questions of race, immigration status, ethnicity, religion, etc. Then I'm arguing in the second half of those is that there's some shifts going on in the way people think about inequality more broadly. And the term social inclusion is used as much as income inequality. And the notion of inclusion goes much beyond just having an adequate standard of living. Adam Smith even talked about this in terms of he talked about being able to walk with dignity in your society. And social inclusion involves participation in the life of the community, particularly the political life, feeling that you're there, recognized, given dignity and respect, part of the story. And that's very much more becomes cultural concept than we have when we started talking about inequality. And then a notion that's now become much more talked about is precarity. You may have a good income and you may feel you're included, but somehow life feels precarious. Somehow you feel you're just one bump away from real trouble. And the notion of a precariat has emerged, a class of people often associated with the gig economy that are the precariat. But I believe that part of the shifting dynamic of how we talk about these things is people were using the term middle class precarity, but in order to distinguish a bit from the precariat, I'll use the term middle class insecurity. The middle class feels insecure and they're unrealized, have unrealized expectations as well. Then I felt I should mention something that we see a lot of if you read the Globe and Mail, intergenerational inequality. Paul Kershaw, the UBC Generation Squeeze, which says, let's look at inequality from the point of view of an age cohort as they move through time. And particularly us, the boomers, have moved through time, and now we're reaching the stage of pensions and healthcare, and we're going to draw on the system very heavily, and the younger generation is going to contribute. And adding to that is the idea that we, the boomers, rode the property boom, the rising price of housing through this, and the younger generation have great difficulty purchasing housing, and the boomer generation has accumulated great wealth in their housing. And you'll see throughout, I've sort of used, I think it's important to flag it, actually, and it's helped me to understand this notion of a housing crisis. But housing, you'll see, appears throughout as we talk about these things. And then the last related conception of inequality is populism, and we've already talked about that. So period one, 1950 to 1975, the first period. I love this phrase at the bottom there. The French call it, they date it from 45 to 75. They call it les 30 glorieuses, the 30 glorious years. So this was a time of stable inequality, okay, and rapidly rising incomes. Income increases that we hadn't seen before the war and haven't seen after the war. So that everybody was getting better off because everybody had the same share, fairly stable. The whole pie was growing, so everybody was getting better off. And then that, I think, is partly where this notion of public concern, the public concern that was the focus of the time, was poverty. And it was phrased very much in the terms of poverty in the midst of plenty. So everybody was doing well, and yet some people didn't have the basics. So this was the way we framed the problem in this rapidly growing economy. Everybody should have the basic, a decent standard of living, and they didn't. So in much of the literature, this period is called the post-war consensus. Okay, that was part of what Les 30 glorieuses was. I believe that part of this consensus, and the literature acknowledges this, came out of the war, that in the war, everyone was asked to sacrifice equally. It didn't matter. And certainly this was a powerful thing for the British welfare state, that the Beveridge and others said, if we're asking everyone to sacrifice their lives and those of their family in the war, we can't have them coming back to a class-based society. That's the project for the post-war period. So I believe there was a very strong social solidarity which came out of the war, and it was here in Canada, it was here in the United States, and we saw. So this partly underpinned the post-war consensus. And the post-war consensus, in some sense, was this balance between market and government. That there was a consensus that we live in a market economy, but we wanted Keynesian stabilization. A fundamental task of government was to stabilize the economy. But what I really want to emphasize is that in this way of conceptualizing the role of government, vitally important for people's well-being was a job. A job was there right at the front. You didn't say, well, do you have any income? Here's some. It was, how do we get people jobs? And of course, the capitalist economy bumped up and down, and you had prolonged unemployment, and people had low income because of high unemployment. So the big task was to stabilize this and make sure we moved as closely and as stably as we could to full employment. And depending on the way you phrase this, I think a proper reading of the literature says Keynesian stabilization is part of the welfare state, and certainly it was for Beveridge in the UK. But then I think Beveridge's 5 giants, after you had a job, you wanted everybody to have income security, particularly in old age. You wanted everyone to have good education or access to education. You wanted everyone to have access to healthcare, regardless of ability to pay, and you wanted everyone to have decent housing. So the 5 giants of Beveridge's welfare state were full employment, income security, particularly in old age, access to education regardless of income, access to healthcare regardless of income, and decent housing. So this was, I would call, the picture of period 1. And we think of, in Canada, Trudeau's terminology, the just society. In the United States, they had the Great Society, but also they had the War on Poverty and the Civil Rights Act. So that throughout in this period, the post-war consensus produced this sense of the appropriate role for government and the market in order to address the general well-being of people. So there's period 1, stable inequality, but I think characterized importantly, in addition, as good economic growth, not too many severe recessions, so Keynesian policy was working, plus the implementation of much of the welfare state, coming with pensions, healthcare, education, and housing. And Canadian governments were quite involved in housing in this period. So then we have period 2, from 1975 to 1995. And this is where we have rising inequality. In the summary, if you look at the decile distribution, the share of the top 10 is going up and the share of the bottom 10 is going down. So big summary, rising inequality. But here we had a couple of other things that I think are important to understand this. The middle incomes and the lower incomes were stagnant or falling through this period. So there was a long period of pretty stagnant middle incomes and lower incomes, and largely because of 3 big recessions. We had the Arab oil embargo recession in 75, the early 80s recession, which was when Volcker went after the high inflation rate, and then we had a big recession in the early 90s in Canada, much bigger than they had in the United States. So we had this poverty went up and down with the recessions, no broad pattern of gain or loss, but 2 things began to emerge. Most importantly, the rising share of the top of the 1%. People began to flag for the first time the rising share of the 1%. Although, you know, the Occupy Wall Street wasn't until 2011, it began to emerge. And interestingly, if we go back to period 1, the 1% was falling, but we didn't even pay attention to that. We didn't even look at the data. So if you go back and look at any literature on the 50 to 75 period, no one's saying, oh, isn't it wonderful? The 1% is falling as well as everyone's getting better off. Not clear, because we didn't have the data and didn't gather it. And even the thinking about poverty in the early period there was pretty basic. We didn't have any sort of official Statistics Canada discussion of poverty until 1968. Now, Jenny Podolak's famous monograph, The Income of Canadians, it really began the look at poverty. And then again in period 2, we have a different kind of low income begin to appear, which is very concerning to people, and that's homelessness. It's something that we hadn't, before we talked about poverty, but now a sort of very different kind of extreme inequality of homelessness begins to emerge. And over time, we begin to see it's very closely connected to family breakdown. It's not a function really of lack of income. It's much more family breakdown, mental health issues, and substance abuse issues. So the pattern of inequality changes dramatically in period 2. Stable middle or falling, 1% rising, and this emerging homelessness. During this same period, through the GATT, free trade started to emerge, and we were moving much more toward a more free trade orientation in society. And then in 89-90, the collapse of the Soviet Union led a lot of people to say, well, planned economies don't work. That economy hasn't been able to achieve what the market economies. So the kind of sense of an activist role of government got weakened. Okay, and so this emerged what I call the neoliberal critique. Okay, now people on the I rather than saying neoliberalism, I'm saying I think we have to understand neoliberalism as a critique of period 1. Okay, so the first pillar of the neoliberal critique was that Keynesianism has failed. After the oil, remember we had pretty well managed Keynesian economy until 73, 75. And then after the oil embargo, we had stagflation, simultaneously rising unemployment and inflation. That wasn't supposed to happen under Keynesianism. Then we had a big recession in the early 80s, and then we had a big recession in the early 90s. So whatever you're doing, trying to stabilize the economy, it ain't working. Keynesianism isn't working. And it's shifted to monetarism, and the focus of macro policy began to shift away from full employment toward saying, well, we really need a strong monetary policy, and the goal of monetary policy should be to control inflation, so that we began to focus much more in overall macro policy on inflation control compared to full employment. Then the neoliberal critique went on to say that the slow growth we're experiencing is a result of an overexpansion of government. We're overregulated, we're overtaxed, we've got a lot of public ownership, we need to deregulate, reduce taxes, and privatize a lot of industries. And finally, it argued that you say the market doesn't work. Well, if you look over here, the government often fails. And the poster child for the neoliberals was public housing. And they had they would show a picture of the St. Louis Pruitt-Igoe public housing project, which I forget when it was, in the early 70s, got dynamited. So there was this public housing, the solution to our problems, and then was just, so they said, look, many of these problems can't be solved by government. And so you have to be aware that in thinking about the market government trade-off, governments can also fail. And then they went on to say that the civil service, and particularly the civil service unions, are special interest groups as much as anybody else. They are rational agents trying to make themselves as well off as possible. And so you can't understand government without recognizing that unions, particularly civil service unions, were so shrink government, particularly many aspects of the welfare state, privatize, deregulate, and change Keynesianism. Well, I think what emerged out of this was, in fact, the third way, as it was called in the UK. There was a lot of talk that the welfare state would be rolled way back. We would see a huge decline in social spending. Well, in fact, there wasn't. The social spending increased as a share of government spending, increased as a share of GDP, and then leveled off in the middle to late 80s. It's very hard to even see a Thatcher effect in the UK. Bumped down for a bit and then got going again, just like it's very, very hard to see a Reagan effect in social policy, and we had neither of those sort of strong ideologues in our. So I think it's better to understand. Now, a lot of the progressives characterized this period 395 to 225 as the triumph of neoliberalism, right? And this is the neoliberal era. I call it the third way, following the, it's the Blair, Clinton, and Mulroney-Chrétien world, which was a kind of synthesis of the neoliberal critique and commitment to using government for social improvement and the welfare of all people. So we accepted less regulation, lower taxes for your trade, etc. But we had a restructured welfare state. We didn't cut pensions, we didn't cut education, we didn't cut healthcare. These were things, of course, that the middle enjoyed. We did cinch in on those aspects of the welfare state which were directed very much at lower income people. We made UI harder to get. We made social assistance harder to get and didn't keep pace with inflation. And we got out of socially assisted housing. Those were the three big ones. And this happened. All of these countries got out of housing. Like, Thatcher had the buy your public housing units and this kind of thing. So So I would say that period 3 is characterized by this inequality. Oh no, sorry, we're just finishing period 2 there, right? No, period 3 to 220, okay? Inequality is high, but it doesn't ever come down very much. And there's in the beginning of period 3, inequality increases a bit, but around 2000, 2007 and 8, some funny things start to happen. Inequality remains high, but the 1% starts to drop and poverty drops. And this is both market and post-market poverty. So there's this puzzling pattern here in the sort of from actually the financial crisis, 2007-8 to 2020, around this synthesis era. But something starts to emerge very late in this period 3, and that's Brexit and the first election of Donald Trump, and the emergence of populism, and perhaps right-wing populism, as a dynamic in the debate. Okay, so let's go to period 4. In period 4, I've argued that it's too soon to really conclude, unless this is just a short interval. If this is really the beginning of an interval, we're very early on in it to decide. At the beginning, when we talked about this, COVID disrupted things extraordinarily. So COVID was something never seen before, this pandemic. And what happened was we literally shut down the economy in May, June of 2020. And so unemployment just soared. Okay, the stock market crashed. But very quickly we came in with plunging interest rates and extensive support for workers, in which paradoxically enough, poverty fell for the first 3 years of COVID, right? But the economy came back quickly, and the housing boom just got juiced by the next 2 years of COVID, because interest rates plunged and people still had their incomes, and that's when housing really, really soared. And so the absolute peak of the Toronto housing market was February 2022. I sold in March. I'm a housing economist. But what's going on in this period, I think, is we're witnessing, I'm calling it a right-wing populist critique of the third way. That they're looking back at this period from 95 to 2020, which there was a synthesis, but it was a consensus, and it was a consensus among, I think, appropriately, the elites. The elite consensus was that we have to have a measure, we have to recalibrate our relationship between market and government, but free trade, deregulation, etc., market forces are something we want to appreciate, and that control of inflation is very important. So I think it's not inappropriate to call this period a period of synthesis between the old post-war welfare state consensus and neoliberalism. This is a synthesis, but now we've got a new critique, which is sort of framing things differently. It's the elites against the people, which is a very different way to frame it, as opposed to high-income people against low-income people, because the people are not defined by income. They're something quite different. Then I think we're entering into a period of great turbulence, which is going to cause significant structural unemployment. Okay, the economy is being restructured. Climate is restructuring economies. Some areas that used to be able to grow X can no longer. Perhaps oil is going to be left in the ground, and assets here are going to become no value. Big restructuring is coming from climate. The Russian invasion and the Israel-Hamas war have destabilized people's perceptions of what the world is and so on, and started to restructure economies. Rapid advances in AI are going to restructure. Election of Trump, clearly with his tariff war and belligerence, is provoking a huge restructuring. And this requires, I think, a fundamental well, we've been struggling with it for years, but if it's structural unemployment, the answer is not fiscal stimulus. And the answer is not cut the interest rates, or at least they'll have a little bit of help, but they don't address the problem. The only way we can address the problem is either find alternative jobs, but the main question we face is, how do you help people in transition out of an industry that's now shrinking? And that gets to retraining, education, mobility. How do you confront questions of, do people have to leave where they've always lived? Is that something we have to confront as a way to think about providing security or better equality going forward? I mean, I think the cod fisheries is a little case study for us. You know, when the cod fisheries collapsed, and as part of our government regulation, we said we're going to license like crazy fishing for cod. So all sorts of little fishing villages around the perimeter of Newfoundland lost all their industry. They were restructured out. And the government offered them money to move and leave their villages. But some people say, we're not leaving our village. Well, what's society's obligation to people who've been offered assistance to leave, but say, no, I want to remain here. This is my land, my history. I want to remain here. And I think we're going to find that. And I shouldn't even say this, but I think this complicates the Indigenous issues. I should have at the preface said everything I say here has I've not talked about inequality due to Indigenous issues and settler colonialism, etc. But you know, do people have the right, if you will, to continue to live where they have, or is part of your obligation to be mobile? And when things are being restructured, that's very tough. Now, we handled it a bit in Canada when the oil boom came. People moved out of the Maritimes and lived in the West for 4 months and then moved back. But when you got a booming area, you can do that. But otherwise, it's hard. Apparently, getting people to staff the auto plants in the United States is a big problem now, because the area around the plants doesn't have enough people. But people don't want to leave where they live. So they come and live in trailer parks for a couple of months and work the auto plant and then go back and live where their home is. So this kind of notion of economic restructuring around education, retraining, and mobility, I think, is going to frame the debate a lot. So lastly, then, I want to just say a few more words about populism. You go and look at the literature. I've done it before, I did it again. And they all begin, well, it's very hard to define. And it's used by very many people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I think the central idea, and most of the literature says this, is that populism, they often say it's a language, it's a way of talking, it's a way of thinking about politics, and sees the basic division between the elite, who control the system, and the people. Then here's a quote that I find very sort of captures it. Populism is a language whose speakers conceive of ordinary people as a noble assemblage, not bounded narrowly by class. View their elite opponents, who control the system, as self-serving and undemocratic, and seek to mobilize the former against the latter. As we start to shift, some people make a distinction between left-wing populism and right-wing populism. Left-wing populism, usually the notion of the elite is very much a business elite orientation. sometimes high civil service that collaborates with the business community, etc. Corporate power, yeah. Whereas in the right-wing populism, elites are much broader than that. They're made up of leaders in business, politics, civil service, the media, universities, professions, NGOs, and the people in these elites shape the system, shape the values which govern what's going on, and they have a lot of what's sometimes called social capital. They know each other, right? And so if you're in an NGO and you want to change what's going on over here, you probably through 2 phone calls will know somebody who's in the senior civil service. And this kind of social capital provides a big part of their power too. And interestingly, these elites are generally high education and they live in big cities, cosmopolitan big cities. And so that once you frame the elites that way, the elite people often becomes a vector for separating people by education and by where they live. And so that when people look at support for Trump and so on, it's very much income and where you live oriented.
Education.
Yes.
Yeah. Income.
Oh, sorry. Yes. So, and not all the literature says this, but I think this is very important. Right-wing populists are a little different than left-wing populists in the sense that they have a third group. It's not just the elites and the people. In right-wing populism, right-wing populists accuse the elites of favoring some other. And in many social democratic societies, they argue that the welfare state is benefiting the other. So it's particularly immigrants, but also people of other religion, other race, and so on. And it often then gets into a kind of cultural nationalism and saying, our way of life is being taken away by these elites. But it's having to do with this identifying someone who's being favored. In Canada and also the United States and in Europe, but particularly Canada and the United States, COVID closures and vaccine mandates led to a surge in right-wing populism under the banner of governments are taking away our freedom. So that the notion that governments can tell you where to move and tell you whether you go to work and tell you to get vaccinated, our freedom is taken away. And then the extreme right-wing populists, of which we see now being articulated in the United States through people like Miller and so on, are that elites and their institutions must be destroyed. That which got created. To me, I look at Les Trente Glorieux and say, look at what we created. And they look back and say, that is horrible. It must be destroyed. And so we've got to go after all the things that we thought were pillars of this period, right? We've got to go after our universities. We've got to go after our journalism. We got to go after, and so on. So that there's this kind of authoritarianism. Anyway, so to wind up to your question, why did income inequality recede from public concern? Okay, I've given you the historical picture. You said bring it up to date. Brought it up to date. Well, the simple answer is when an election came, the ballot question was who can stand up to Trump? The background to that was it was a time for a change election. Justin had been in power for majority or minorities for 10 years. He was too progressive, so I better be not Justin. And of course, in that prior period, we had a strong, I'm a little leery of calling Poilievre a right-wing populist because he doesn't have that strong anti-immigration, anti-other side to him. Some of his base certainly does, but so I'll call him, we had a strong populist in Mr. Poilievre. It's too soon to tell now that he's finally back in the House, how radically populist he'll be, but So at one level, you could say income inequality receded from public concern because we had this background of some populism coming. It's time for a change from Justin and a new ballot question. But I think part of what led it to recede was the shifting the way we conceptualize the problem, and that we started to move away from thinking about poverty and low income. We have the word precariat around, and homelessness is certainly a focus. And interestingly, when the federal government first came back into housing, homelessness was the first thing they came back in. And speaking of the new elite consensus, Harper kept it. It wasn't turned back. And then the 1% went up, and it's now drifting down. And but somehow the middle has started to become the focus of how we think about inequality. And I was able to find the first big statement by Justin Trudeau, and it was sort of like their first policy statement, and it was about 20 pages long, was titled "Building a Stronger Middle Class." So everything got around questions of the middle. Okay, so, and then populism starts to come in, and populism wants to talk about the people, and the middle and the ordinary people are very much part of the people. So we began to phrase our discussions around the middle and the people, as opposed to inequality as classically measured, or as the instruments we used to talk about it, or the policies we thought were going to be. I have some sense that progressives also didn't celebrate their successes enough. It was always, there's another problem tomorrow. And in fact, in this 95 to 2020, we had two very extraordinary improvements in our overall social welfare system, which was the improvements to the guaranteed income supplement, which is in effect a guaranteed annual income for seniors, and what is now the Canada Child Benefit, which is in close to a guaranteed annual income for people with children. So we had very big improvements, but somehow it never comes out and says, we're the people that delivered you X. It's looking at something else. There's this kind of unwillingness to accept. So in any event, I think part of the reason why it disappeared is not just the ballot question, but that this insecurity of the middle, combined with populism, is the way the larger community is framing inequality. And as I thought about this, it always puzzled me why the affordability of ownership is such an issue that people feel passionately about. You know, if you looked at every election, whether municipal, provincial, or federal over the last decade, the difficulty of buying a house is there. Well, if you look at it, 65% of the population of the households already own a house, right? 20% were never going to buy a house. So it's a problem for a very small number of people. And they are middle-class people. It's the people who thought they could buy a house and can't are basically middle-class people. And the ones who are getting over the hurdle are being helped by the bank of mom and dad. So they're upper middle-class people. But it always puzzles me to say, here's something that affects so few people, and yet it's so people really this way. And this was just something over the last day I was thinking. To me, that maybe the way to understand that is it's part of middle class insecurity. Parents care about it tremendously, and they say to themselves, "Well, this world, what's happened? I mean, we had this life expected this life for our children, and now they can't realize it. So it's a kind of lightning rod for their insecurity. And so middle class insecurity is framing the way we think about things. And that's partly why it doesn't appear on there.
George, thank you very, very much.
Thank you. That was great.
You've given us a lot to think about and reflect on.
It's always what we say about seminars. A lot to think about and reflect on.
One of the things that I thought was, a couple of things that were interesting. One is the discussion of how the notion of your position in the hierarchy is not so much, it's not only about income any longer, but there's a kind of standard of living or sense of living. And so I think that is partly, I think, why people are not focusing so much on income, they're focusing on a range of social issues that may affect the way in which they live, that are irrespective of their income. And that makes it easier to appeal to people in a kind of right-wing populist way. Say, in effect, you may be well off, but your society is going to be stolen from you by the other. And so there's a lot of worrisome aspects to that. The other thing I thought was, one of the things you talked about was the restructuring of the economy. Clearly makes necessity of dealing with structural unemployment differently. And I'm thinking, what about the technological change? You mentioned AI. What other kinds of technological changes are going to mean that the economy we're dealing with in the immediate future, for the next 20, 30 years, is going to be so different? And nobody seems to be thinking about how to deal with it. We talk about the need for improving productivity, but we don't seem to know how to do that.
Know how to do that, no. I think when when was it? I guess it was about just before the election of Trump. So about 2014, I started to write a book on the welfare state. So I was going to do a book on the welfare state. And so you look and you say, okay, you got to look at what pensions are, and you got to look at this, and you got to look. And I thought, that's when I first started to think, well, wait a minute, it's not cyclical unemployment that's causing all the problems, it's structural, but we haven't started to think about that. And then, because I was writing from this period, I was thinking from today, I thought, if you were really talking about the history of the welfare state, you've got to talk about immigration policy from 1950 and trade policy from 1950, because those profoundly affect the labor market, people's incomes, and the structure of the economy. And yet all this thinking about the welfare state, we didn't say, well, let's think about trade at the same time. Let's think about immigration at the same time. Let's think about, stabilization policy. If you pick up most books about the welfare state, they won't have stabilization policy in there as a fundamental component of the welfare state.
So yeah, that's kind of, that gets to the point I was thinking, which is that it's more this, I sometimes call it policy complexity, right? There's a lot of dimensions here. There's structural changes in the economy. Technology is a big thing that I'm interested in my research, not just AI, but also the development of big technology companies, which is not the only thing driving more concentration in most industries, but there's a period where if you look at almost all industries, there's a higher level of concentration. So that's another factor in inequality. Right. Changing labor laws and things like that. The inability to adapt certain policies to new technologies. Like you talk about the gig economy, it's hard to protect workers structurally in the gig economy with the old frameworks, right? Yet it's hard to create new frameworks because then you're accused of disturbing innovation or preventing innovation. So that's what I mean by complexity. There's so many dimensions that it's easier to simplify things by saying, it's these immigrants that are causing the problem, or it's some China that's causing the problem, things like that, right? So that's kind of what I'm looking at in terms of the current era is we still have to think about, let's get at the structural causes of the inequality, right, and economic change generally, right? But how do we get our policy systems you know, how do we get our head around that from a policy perspective, right? You know, that's a challenge.
Yeah, interestingly, when I was doing this work on the growth of neoliberalism,
Yeah.
back with what was called the Mount Pelerin Society, which was where Hayek and a group of pro-market people, they said to themselves, how is it, and he actually wrote a paper on this, how is it that the social democrats control the intellectual agenda? How is it? They got the LSE, they've got the university thinking for them. So the neoliberals started right in the 50s saying, to change the debate, we've got to have our own intellectual framework to engage and change things. And to the point where these think tanks, as we see in Project 2025, are drafting stuff to hand to government when they come in. So I think somehow, and people have tried, but it hasn't, we haven't got a kind of, let's call it left intellectual ecosystem, you know, working. I mean, we don't have people saying, as soon as Carney's elected, here is the progressive way to deal with economic restructuring. Whereas the neoliberals have. So,
but like if you go to AI, you mentioned AI, right? It's not traditional class, you know, conflict there or class subordination, right?
No.
It could be work becoming less important as a source of income, right? It could be the ultimate result of AI. If AI does replace jobs, which is quite possible, right?
The best thing I saw about AI, or little vignette, was in a university lecture. So they have it. They said, what AI is going to do is put the people in the first two rows become much more productive, and they're going to earn much higher incomes. Everybody else in the back rows isn't going to get a job. That's just, it's going to, if you can harness it to your particular thing, it's going to, yeah, I don't know how you talk about it. I must say, I'm always a bit uneasy about saying we live in a more complex time than the past.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're all.
I don't mean more complex. I'm just saying that it's trickier to apply old frameworks to new ones now because of structural changes in the economy, you know, things like that. Right?
Maybe, I don't know, just apropos of this, maybe it's trickier to apply new frameworks because we had a framework which we so liked, and it's deeply embedded in us. And we keep thinking this is the one that can help us through if we just recover it somehow. And so maybe this era is one where this kind of, the post-war consensus is a really unique thing. But of course, it was preceded by the turbulence of the 20s, the Great Depression, the war, etc. But this period of turbulence followed by the solution that succeeded is very hard to get your mind out of and into saying we need to think differently about these things.
Just wanted to say for the people that are on Zoom, if you have a question, just speak up, because the way we have things set up here, it's hard for me to see whether you've got your hand up and so on. So just speak up and ask your question if you have a question. And in the meantime, I have a question, George. During the federal election campaign, Chrystia Freeland made a remark, and I thought when George gives his presentation, I must ask, is this true? She said that the median income in Canada is about the same as the median income in the United States. In fact, it may be a little bit higher.
I think what it would have to be would be if you factor in private education spending and healthcare in the United States. In the United States, healthcare, by and large, well, there's public insurance for the elderly and the poor, and the public insurance is provided through work. So people get their healthcare through work.
Mhm.
Okay, so you can think of it as deduction in their wage as a result of that.
Mhm.
So if once you, I don't know that median income, I don't think so.
I saw recently statistics showing clearly that the average level of per capita wealth in the US is much higher than in Canada, but the median level of
Wealth, yes.
is significantly higher in Canada compared to the United States. It wasn't a small amount. It wasn't as big as the gap in terms of average.
Yeah.
But it was very meaningful.
Yeah. And that's where housing is, again, it becomes so tricky because housing is, no, I know, but I mean, in terms of wealth of people, it's your pension present value and your house equity are the big components of wealth up to the top 10% or something. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And
So what,
something else I was wondering about, George, is that, as you said, the United States, in terms of wealth, in your third period, has grown much wealthier than other parts of the world. But during the same period, Americans are more or less happy. They're amongst the unhappiest people in the world.
Money is never.
What's this?
Money doesn't buy happiness.
No, it doesn't.
yes.
And that ties in some way to the right-wing populism you were talking about, I think.
Maybe, yes, that you've got a decent standard of living, but you're not happy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, there may be something to that. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. That and I think this notion of precarity or insecurity is an important one. And I think a lot of people feel that the order that they grew up in is unstable now.
Mhm.
And they feel now, here I am, 78. I feel the world's so unstable. I don't know what's going on.
It's true that, I mean, you're 78, I'm 80, we came out of the consensus era. We were raised in the consensus.
Yeah.
And I look back on that and I think, my father was a machinist, he was clearly a working class guy. We lived a middle class life. I mean, I remember we did a survey in the 1970s, in which one of the questions was, no, sorry, in the late 60s, one of the questions gave people the opportunity to label themselves with a variety of labels, and among them were working class and middle class. And like 25% of the sample said both applied to them.
Right.
Now that's, you come out of the post-war consensus, you get that sense. You could live a middle class life on a working class income.
Right.
Because the working class incomes were they weren't as unequal, they weren't stable. There was more unionized employment. It just generally seemed like a better era for average working people.
Right.
But didn't last. Then you got the recessions that hit in the 70s, hit everybody, I guess, and hit them hard as well. And I think to myself now, I'm also in a period of which we generated wealth in our, we didn't generate it, the economy generated wealth in our house.
Right.
We sold it. Now, I'm wealthier than I was before, except I'm paying rent, but the rent is manageable with the income. And so I think to myself, if I were a young person coming up now, where their parents expected that social mobility was going to be there, we were able to buy a house, you should be able to buy a house.
Right.
Well, you can't buy a house because we sold our house and it made too much money, and we can't,
I ask my children a lot about this. I have 4 kids.
Yeah.
And one of them's a single woman, and who's now just had a child on her own. And interestingly, they want a house, and Bank of Mom and Dad helped her get a house. But among her friends, although they want housing, they don't feel this visceral resentment. They don't feel they deserve it. No, they just, whereas their parents feel very upset, which is very paradoxical. And again, this is getting anecdotal, but a lot of them like the big city life. They don't want to move to Brampton or Port Hope or Oshawa. And so many of her friends have now started to jump to Markdale or Guelph or places where the downtown still has little shops and it's not big box and, it's not a Brampton in their mind. So they're willing to make a move to have the more, whether you call it cosmopolitan or whatever it is, life that they.
So I got another question. You were talking about the Canadian election, but the American election didn't talk about inequality either. It was all the populism, the displacing, and he talked about, when was the last time an American or a Canadian election have dealt more with inequality? I mean,
well, I remember Obama said, well, the Occupy Wall Street, and that was only 2011. And Obama was quoted as saying, income inequality is the existential question of our time.
Yeah, so it would be 2011. Interesting.
Yeah, and it just then, well, and one of the guys who organized Occupy Wall Street, said that in retrospect, he thinks it was, it was, not only was it a huge protest, but it was self-consciously leaderless. And so they didn't take this moment to say, how do we build a political structure, movement, engagement, etc., to address the issue? Yeah. And this actually, there's one thing I did want to, when you talked about increasing concentration, one of the things of the neoliberal critique was they said a lot of the attempt to regulate monopolies is misplaced, because even though they can influence prices, they're so good at innovation, the trade-off is worth it.
Yeah, the Schiffer
Yeah. And that, took over the Justice Department and so on. And so there was only a
But
few.
even right now, there's globally a whole debate about concentration. When you look at Europe, you look at Canada, and the progressive forces are on different sides. You saw the commentary, I've studied this, the Competition Bureau held their consultations. The unions, in terms of the airline industry, wanted to avoid breakup the concentrated airlines, and the think tanks, like the Canadian Anti-Monopoly Project and the one or two other think tanks, which were progressive think tanks, they thought we should try to open up the market to foreign competition and stuff like that, right? So even on the progressive side, the unions want more regulated industries, which sometimes means living with more concentration,
right,
and treating more things like public utilities and so on, right? And so in the States, the same thing. You've got some people saying, on the progressive side, the big tech type companies eventually have to be regulated like public utilities, right? Because essentially they are. They're privatized public utilities. Their function in society and in the economy, right?
Yeah.
And yet no one can get their head around what that looks like in the American economy.
No.
It's to regulate Google like a public utility, even though that may be the actual good solution, right? And it'll detract from innovation or whatever. So that's what I'm saying. Like, it's so hard to get your head around the policies that may make sense because there's no constituency for them.
Right. Well, try this one on. I didn't know whether I really believe it or not, but if you said, let's have a march down to talk about income inequality in Canada, you'd get a coalition of people involved, and there'd be people talking about climate, people talking about Palestine, and so the sort of progressive community that started to argue that all these issues are interrelated, and so what's going on in Palestine and what's going on in climate, what's going on in inequality are all underpinned by, however you want to call it, the market system, the capitalist system. But I was thinking, so that you never got anybody who said, here is a movement around inequality. Every time you got people together, sort of on the street, it was across so many issues that people, a lot of people got turned off because they had different views on Gaza or different views on climate, but also I don't know, it's sort of,
It's a problem faced by any big tent political party. In fact, the Democrats are facing this with existential threat at the moment because they've got division with people who said we have to go beyond income and class. We've got to think about all these other people who are affected by negative aspects of the society. And I'm not sure that they think about bringing it all together under one umbrella and being able to say, well, this over here results from that over there. And I don't think they think that they may not be true, and they're not sure that they believe it. So they're divided.
of course, Trump is a big tent. I mean,
Yeah.
who would have thought Christian, these Christian jurisprudence guys who want to turn the United States into a Christian society are allied with the tech boys.
Yeah, some of those Christians, if we're gonna call some people who are radical Islamists, I think we should talk sometime about some of these people are Christianists.
I agree.
I was at that, remember that Christie Pitts,
Oh, right.
there was that anti-immigrant, think of what they call it, Canada First rally.
Mhm.
And then a lot of progressive groups at least tried to negotiate around it. But the two biggest ones I saw there was QP 3903 and also Seniors for Climate Action. They had a whole big group, right? It was this great, like, okay, how is this, like, they're not even related to each other, but they were probably the biggest streams of folks opposing the.
I think
the first.
one of the interesting things is Greta Thunberg. So there she is lecturing the world on stuff. And I read a thing about 2 years ago. She started to talk to people. Said, "Well, you haven't talked very much to climate people in the developing world." So she went out and started to talk to them, and she thought, "Oh, this is more complicated than I thought. There's issues here," and she got so into it. Now her bigger thing is Gaza. But I mean, I thought once she started to say, "Well, I've got to hear this other voice," her unambiguous voice on climate changed.
So how do we make inequality sexy to everyone in the same way, right?
Yeah.
A sexy issue, right? Like in the way that will get a political purchase, right? It's tricky. How do we do that? I mean, I think if people are denied healthcare more in the US,
Yeah.
right, the healthcare thing blows up. There might be another, push toward, because right now the Democrats don't want to go near single payer healthcare. It's just, they just stay away from it because it seems to be a losing issue electorally. But that could change if there could be a backlash against the erosion of healthcare.
Right.
So something like that could do it, maybe in Canada.
But yeah, on health, I sort of think the declining quality of healthcare, I think people understand, but the solutions are they're marginal. You got to do this. We got to have a little better, system to record things.
Yeah.
There's nothing to say, let us really make a move on this. So it's
You need that galvanizing issue, though.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the elite probably can deal with policy complexity more than everyone else can, right? So you need that galvanizing.
but the elite on most of the big
Maybe-
thrusters can manage it, right? I mean, has globalization hurt us? No, it's improved our, the intellectual community is larger and more engaged and so on around the world. And so, most of the things has immigration, I mean, I think most people I know, one of the things that gives them great joy as a Canadian to be seeing some family, with a startup going well and on the street corner of their neighborhood. I mean, that just gives them great joy. So that we're not suffering.
I'm just wondering if any of the people on Zoom would like to ask any questions. Greg, I see you there. You've got your microphone off. Do you have a question or a comment?
Yeah, sorry. There are a lot of things. I'm sorry. Part of the discussion's been difficult to follow because the questions I couldn't hear. Anyway, we need to talk a bit about the format. But I wondered about, a whole number of things, and I don't want to take people's time, but You talked about the Depression a bit in your comments after your talk. Um, as someone who grew up in the 50s and 60s, it's the Depression as well as the war were on people's minds a lot more than later. And in fact, all the institutions that helped people get through and that they built on um, uh, led to some people thinking they didn't need them. And that the philosophy that the private sector could do everything better. And that has grown and grown and grown and grown. So they talk about privatizing healthcare and so on, but there's no reason to believe it will be better. That's just one comment about the ideological change. You also raised the issue about housing, and housing's been a concern at least since the 1889 Royal Commission on Labor and Capital, in which housing was seen, ownership of housing was seen as a basic to stability of Canadian society. And it's just carried on. Anyway,
I found it interesting the way, obviously there was somewhere in Carney's group, they were trying to stir up a sense of a Canadian sense of let's work together. They decided the wartime was the one they would draw on. And I think they completely misrepresented what the actual experience of the Canadian government in housing was.
right.
During the war, they built about 60,000 houses, which at the time was significant. But as soon as the war was over, CMHC wanted to get out as fast as possible. And the two big tasks were, let's get a construction industry up and running, private sector, and let's get a mortgage market up and running, private sector. So I think the biggest thing that led to the improvement of ownership housing in Canada in that period was public mortgage insurance. So people had access to mortgage insurance, which made it people able to buy houses.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Grady. Jen, did you have any comments or questions?
They might be on lunch.
That's true. That's
Oh,
true.
hi, I'm still here. I was just trying to unmute. No, I've just been listening. It was very interesting conversation. I'm friends with Greg, and I'm a 40-year-old female business owner. So it was just interesting. Kind of came from a working class background, and yeah, it was just a very interesting conversation. So thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us. Well, we should probably wrap up now. So,
Much myself.
George, thank you so much for being with us.
Shane, thank you for the invitation. And I love puzzling over these things.
Well, I always find that your insights are very informative, and you give me a lot to think about. So with your permission, we'll put this on our webpage and other people can see it too.
Sure, certainly.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.